So MMT starts with a simple observation, and that is that the US dollar is a simple public monopoly. In other words, the United States currency comes from the United States government. It can't come from anywhere else. So what that means is that the federal government is nothing like a household. In order for households or private businesses to be able to spend, they've got to come up with the money, right? And the federal government, it can never run out of money. It cannot face a solvency problem, bills coming due that it can't afford to pay. It never has to worry about finding the money in order to be able to spend. So the deficit definitely matters. It's just that it matters in ways that we're not normally taught to understand. Normally, I think people tend to hear deficit and think it's something that we should strive to eliminate, that we shouldn't be running budget deficits, that they're evidence of fiscal irresponsibility. And the truth is, the deficit can be too big. Evidence of a deficit that's too big would be inflation, but the deficit can also be too small. It can be too small to support demand in the economy. And evidence of a deficit that is too small is unemployment. So if you think of the government deficit as the difference between what the government spends into the economy and what it taxes back out, then imagine a government that spends $100 into the US economy, but it only taxes 90 of those dollars back out. We label that a government deficit, and we record that on the government's books. But what we forget to do is pay attention to the fact that there's now $10 somewhere in the economy that wouldn't have been there otherwise, that is put there by the government's deficit. In other words, their deficits become our surpluses. And so when we talk about red ink and the government having all of this red ink, we have to remind ourselves that their red ink becomes our black ink, and their deficits are our surpluses. And the question is then, should you expand fiscal policy? Should you run bigger budget deficits in order to boost growth? So what is the objective? What is the proper policy goal? And I think the right policy goal is to maintain a balanced economy where you're at full employment, you're guarding against an acceleration in inflation risk. And economists tend to understand that the kinds of things that you can do to boost longer-term growth are investments in things like education, infrastructure, R&D. Those are the sorts of things that tend to accelerate productivity growth so that longer term real GDP growth can be higher. So there are ways in which the government can make investments today that increase deficits today, that produce higher growth tomorrow, and build in the extra capacity to absorb those higher deficits. If you think of an economy that is in a depressed state, look at the sink on the right. Look at the little people. You got people sitting around not doing anything, right? The little orange fella, the little pink guy, they're not working. They're just sitting. So you could imagine an economy with idle resources and a government with the capacity to come in, mobilize those resources, hire them, put them to work like Warren did with his kids, get them working and doing something productive, and spending the currency to move those real resources, bring them into employment, and the economy does better as a result, right? You have more output, you have more income, you have more savings as a result, better economy. So what is the deficit? What does it mean? Let's suppose the government spends 100 of these stacks into the economy, and then it comes along and it collects some tax. It's going to take 4 of those stacks away. We label that a government deficit. That's what we call it. But wait a minute, they put 10 in and tax 4 away, they've left behind 6. They left behind 6. The government deficit is nothing more than a financial contribution to some other part of the economy. It sits somewhere outside the government sector as a surplus on someone else's balance sheet. We hear about government red ink. No one ever bothers to point out that it produces black ink on somebody else's ledger. This is the US. This is actual historical data for the United States of America going back to the 1950s. This is Godley's sector balance framework. And what Wynne did was say, we can think about the financial questions for any economy by breaking it into three pieces. I'm the US government, and all of the people on this side of the room are the US private sector. You're all the households and all the businesses in the US economy. And these guys are the rest of the world. Wynne said that's all there is. He called it stock flow consistent modeling. It meant that if any payment flows out of one sector, it has to flow into some other sector. And if it leaves as a $5 payment, it arrives as a $5 payment in some other part of the economy. So the red here is me, the US government. The blue here is you, the US private sector. The green is the rest of the world. Okay? First thing you notice is that it's a perfect mirror image. Why? Because if $5 goes out of one sector, $5 goes in another sector, deficits and surpluses have to cancel one another out. Looking back to 1950, what do you notice about the government's financial balance? It is almost always in deficit. Red ink for almost the entire time. Okay, what do you notice about the private sector's balance? The blue. Surpluses almost the entire time.
The reason the federal government is not like a state government, not like a household, not like a private business, is because the government spends first. The government spends first, and then it can tax and remove some of what it has spent from my hands, or it can borrow. But those operations come after the spending. So let's do this. If I'm government and I spend $100 into the economy and I end up taxing just $90 away, okay? So I spend 100 in, I tax 90 away, I am deficit spending. I'm government, my ledger will record minus 10. Kelton is government, minus 10 on my ledger. But my deficit deposited $10 into some part of the economy, right? I spent 100 in, I took 90 back out, I taxed 90 out, somebody has 10. That's my deficit, okay? Mm-hmm. So now that I've placed $10 in the economy somewhere, I come along behind there and I say, whenever I run a deficit, I match my deficit spending with bond sales. So now I hold up 10 treasuries. I say, I'm selling these, who wants to buy them? Well, I've already placed $10 in the economy. My deficit put the dollars in that can now be traded out for the treasuries. Here's the really important part of the story. I don't have to do that. They don't need to borrow in order to spend. They've already spent the dollars in, right, to hyperinflation, because what they hear is the Fed is printing money or the government is printing money. And they've been somewhere along the lines, they've encountered this argument, they've heard this idea that the way that you get inflation, especially very high inflation, is when governments so-called print money. Okay, and what I'm suggesting is that it's not how the financing happens that gives you the inflation risk. It's the spending itself, right? It turns out hyperinflation is really kind of interesting. There was a study that was done. If people are interested, they can use the Google machine and they can type in Cato, of all places, okay? It comes out of the Cato Institute, which, as you know, is a libertarian. This is not a left-wing progressive organization, but 3 researchers produced a study maybe 4 or 5 years ago on hyperinflation, and they put it out through the Cato Institute. And what they did is said, we want to understand hyperinflation. So we're going to try to track down every single instance where hyperinflation has happened on Earth in human history, right? And they found 56 examples of hyperinflation. And then they said, we want to understand what caused hyperinflation in all 56 cases. It's really fascinating. And the thing that's, I think, the most interesting isn't what they found, but what they didn't find. What they didn't find was a single case of hyperinflation happening anywhere in the history of the world because technocrats, governments were trying to run a full employment economy and printing money. Never happened. So you mentioned Zimbabwe. So what did happen? So they study each of these cases. In the case of Zimbabwe, what you had was Mugabe coming to power, taking land away from whites and redistributing it. Freedom fighters were rewarded for their efforts. The land was redistributed. And initially, it went to Blacks with little and frankly, probably no experience farming the land. And they just didn't initially know how to produce. And so what you had was just a collapse in an agricultural economy, no food production. And so food prices just went soaring, and there's your hyperinflation. So, when we think about too much money chasing too few goods, it wasn't the too much money piece so much as it was the too few goods piece. And so it was effectively a supply shock, right? Just a collapse in output that sent prices soaring. So it's not what people think, right? People think Zimbabwe happened as the government came in and printed money. That's not the story at all.
So it's impossible really to put a number. Nobody can. How much debt is too much debt? If you look at Japan today, you see a country where the debt to GDP ratio is something like 240%, well above, orders of magnitude above where the US is today, or even where the US is forecast to be in the future. And so the question is, how is Japan able to sustain a debt of that size? Wouldn't it have an inflation problem? Wouldn't it lead to rising interest rates? Wouldn't this be destructive in some way? And the answer to all of those questions, as Japan has demonstrated now for years, is simply no. Japan's debt is close to 240% of GDP, almost a quadrillion, that's a very big number, yen. Long-term interest rates are very close to zero. There's no inflation problem. And so despite the size of the debt, there are no negative consequences as a result. And I think Japan teaches us a really important lesson. If you think about what happened after World War II, when the US national debt went in excess of 100%, close to 125% of GDP. If we were talking about it the way we talk about it today, as burdening future generations, as posing a grave national security risk, we would have to scratch our heads and say, wait a minute, do we think that our grandparents burdened the next generation with all of those bonds that were sold during World War II to win the war, build the strongest middle class, produce the longest period of peacetime prosperity, the golden age of capitalism? All of that followed in the wake of fighting World War II, increasing deficits, massively increasing the size of the national debt. And of course, the next generation inherits those bonds. They don't become burdens to the next generation, they become their assets.